So, welcome to this Royal Society of Biology Plant Health series event, which is held in partnership with the UK government's Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Defra for short, from now on. So RSB and Defra are involved in a partnership that aims to develop a diverse community across these sectors and build UK plant health capability, capacity and resilience. So today's event, as you all know, will focus on Defra's research and development programme. And you'll get an overview of the programme, including how research needs are being met, before hearing from several plant health professionals whose research projects have been funded through the programme. So my name is Geraint Parry, and for my day job, I am the Executive Officer of the Association of Applied Biologists, which is a learned society that focuses on, unsurprisingly, applied biology, but in the context of plants and agricultural biology, or plant and agricultural science. But in the context of RSB, I chair the RSB Plant Sciences Group, and I'm also a member of the Plant Health Advisory Group as well, which is kind of the genesis of this this series of webinars. Okay, so we have a super busy schedule today. We have got 4 exciting speakers, but we also do plan to have 15 minutes for questions at the end. So if you have any questions for any of our speakers, and they'll all come back at the end, so we're not going to do questions after individual talks, but everyone's going to come back at the end. So if you do have any questions, please write them in the Q&A section, not in the chat section, and then we'll pick them up and I will ask the questions at the end. Okay, so our first speaker, without further ado, is Clare Trivedi, who is the Plant Health Research and Development Manager. She's responsible for the oversight and strategic direction of the Plant Health Research Programme at Defra. She works with a range of research providers and in coordination with other funders, including UKRI, other plant health stakeholders, of which there are many on this call, I know. Claire's currently developing a plant health R&D strategy document, which will be published soon, and she'll mention that today. And finally, to introduce Clare, she's previously worked with Forest Research and the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. So Clare, if you switch your video on and share your screen, and then we can get going, and I will come back and introduce the next speaker afterwards. Thanks very much, Clare.
So yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to talk to you today about Defra's Plant Health R&D programme, and you'll see from my title, I'll be really emphasising throughout how it's a programme of collaboration. If you can move to the next slide. So I will start by describing what Defra's need is for plant health research and the role of science. I'll be outlining our strategic research objectives, explaining to you what our research needs are and how we've defined those. And then the rest of the presentation will be giving you a flavour of our approaches to research and what we deliver and how. Thank you, Emily. So to start, this is background context that is very familiar, I'm sure, to most people on the call, but obviously there are a vast number of potential plant pests and diseases, and these are all in the UK screened through the UK Plant Health Risk Register, which has already assessed over 1,200 pests and pathogens. And it's identified over 700 for further research or as potential threat. So you can see here that even just looking at the immediate impacts, not including, for example, social environmental impacts, pests and diseases, will affect a large number of sectors. So we know that the threats to plant health are increasing, and this has been attributed to several factors, including climate change and the increase in global trade and travel, which both of those things provide more entry pathways and establishment pathways. Next slide, please, Ellie. But when we look at the wider values of plants, when we include in those calculations things like carbon sequestration, air filtration, recreation and landscape and mental health benefits, then we think that the annual value to the UK of plants is at least £15.7 billion a year. And so that's obviously the asset value that's at risk from pests and diseases. Proactive investment in science and innovation for biosecurity can therefore prevent the full extent of outbreak costs, so the immediate cost of managing a pest and disease when it arrives, but also protect from harm that enormous asset value and the goods and services that healthy plants contribute to us all. Next slide. So protecting our plant biosecurity is a well-established government priority. It's outlined in the 25-year environment plan. And then it's further described in terms of policy in the GB biosecurity strategy and the tree health resilience strategy. And as many of you will know, we literally just published last week an updated version of the GB biosecurity strategy. And actually those graphics in those earlier slides came from that. So science and innovation and technology is at the heart of our approach, and this is, taken forward again in this latest GB plant biosecurity strategy. So we outline there 4 key outcomes for biosecurity, but the 4th is all about enhanced technical capability. So it's around building plant health capability, but also making sure we can make use of emerging innovative science and technology in order that we can keep pace with those changing threats and ensure preparedness for the future. So that is at a GB level what the governments across the GB have committed to. If you go to the next slide, as Geraint mentioned, we're now preparing a more detailed document which will outline Defra's plant health R&D approach. And this really describes exactly why we need to have an R&D programme, and this is to meet Defra's needs specifically. So it's around building understanding and knowledge of plant health issues and the potential solutions so that obviously we can protect ourselves, but also so that we can show global leadership. It's around providing evidence so that as we make policy and as our delivery partners act on the ground, we can make the most robust decisions. It's also around developing and deploying innovation and new technologies, and to provide world-class research capability. Thanks, Ellie. In terms of defining exactly what the research focus needs to be in terms of the substance, we've looked at all of our the policy needs and the operational needs that are outlined in those documents I've just mentioned to you. So we work right across the biosecurity continuum. So it starts with risk and horizon scanning at the international level. And then it moves through to how we can prevent pests and diseases arriving at the border, but also what we can do at the border to protect the UK. Moving into surveillance and diagnostics, and then inland, when things do arrive, we will be looking at management of solutions and options. And overall, this focus is to protect both productivity and to facilitate trade, particularly in horticulture, forestry, and agriculture. And again, that is all outlined in the new plant biosecurity strategy. Again, there's nothing new there compared to the previous version. If we move on again. We also published, though, in 2019, and this follows on particularly from the 25-year environment plan. So we've seen a bit of a shift from that pure focus on managing individual pests and diseases in order to enhance productivity and facilitate trade, to a recognition that we need to protect our natural capital throughout the landscape. And the means to do that is through developing resilience in the landscape. And so the Tree Health Resilience Strategy introduced this particular object to help our treescapes adapt to long-term stresses. And this can both be adapting them so that they are less likely to succumb to pests and diseases, but also restoring species like ash and elm, for example, back into the landscape. Okay, so taking all of those sort of operational and policy needs into account, we've distilled down to 6 key themes for our R&D needs. I haven't got time to go into these in detail, but the headings are, first is risk assessment and horizon scanning. Second is around inspections, diagnostics and surveillance. The third is the management of pests and diseases, particularly through integrated pest management and nature-based solutions. The fourth is that resilience and adaptation bit that I just spoke about. The next is around plant health behaviours, and that's around understanding what motivates and constrains individuals and groups to change their behaviours in support of plant health objectives. And the final is evaluation. That's just recognising that our team has a role in evaluating the progress of policy change. Okay, next one. So that previous slide was the sort of the what we want to do. This slide summarises how we want to do it, because of course we don't want to just deliver R&D projects, we want them to have real impact on the ground. So all of our projects across our programme seek to be collaborative. This is around us participating through national and international research collaborations, us collaborating with other funders, and also working with our colleagues right across Defra, devolved administrations and delivery agencies. So we as a plant health evidence team will be managing all of these partnerships all of the time in order that we can leverage the maximum benefit from the work that we're supporting. The second is something that Bianca will talk more about in her presentation, but we really seek for as many of our projects as possible to have co-design throughout. So that means involving the research users, the research customers throughout project life cycles, from when they're established right through their operation. And then obviously we want knowledge transfer and exchange to be happening as results come through. And we also do that at a programme level as well. So before we make calls, for example, we will have spoke to research users and other stakeholders. The fourth approach is around that part of, I've spoken about innovation. Several of the research needs, particularly, for example, the diagnostics and management of diseases, we're really looking to deliver innovation there. How can we make best use of new technologies to have the best impact? And one thing we've been talking to stakeholders about recently is launching a plant health innovation fund to help with that. And then finally, our work to support a research skills infrastructure. So we're supporting PhDs, fellowships, internships, and so on. Okay, so overall, we've spent more than 34 million since 2014. In this current financial year, we're, to give you an idea of scale, we're working with 94 projects, working with more than 20 collaborators. And you can see just a breakdown there. So over half focus on one particular pest and disease, and then other projects cut across and multiple pests and diseases. Thank you. Next one. Okay, so I'm going to skim through the rest of the slides slides relatively quickly because I'm aware of time, but these are just really to give you a flavour of some of the kind of ways that we work. So future-proofing plant health is our big plant health partnership. It takes up a significant part of our budget, and it brings together the expertise of Fera, Forest Research, Kew, JNCC and Natural England, but also a really wide range of subcontractors who work with those partners. If you go to the next slide. And all future-proofing projects have to meet these 8 design principles, which I won't go through in detail now, but they basically support those research approaches that I just described to you. And next one. So this would be a good example of a future-proofing project. It was a big project that's looking at OPM and alternative control strategies. And you can see that it brings together Fera, FR and JNCC, who have all worked together. But they're importantly working with stakeholders on the ground in order to find not just the most technically efficient approach, but an approach that will actually work, you know, for operators. UFresco is the main way that we engage at an international level, though we also support some Horizon 2020 projects. So that is a network of organisations that fund research on plant health. It was initially a European network, but it is now global. And it enables us to coordinate with like-minded plant health commissioners all around the world, mostly government, but not always. So we've got 12 active UFresco projects, and we're going to hear about one of those this afternoon. Next one. We also work closely with UKRI, and I just wanted to show you the 2 programs that we're co-funding with UKRI. So the first is the BBSRC Bacterial Plant Pathogens Programme, where we've contributed £1 million, and that is delivering 8 projects all around bacterial plant pathogens. We also work closely with NERC on the NERC Treescapes programme that's also running right now. And in this one, we contribute £55,000 per annum. Many of you will be familiar with this programme as well. So there's 6 projects running. There's also, these are the main projects. There's also smaller projects, and we're also funding through this a new NERC Plant Health fellow who is just starting at the minute to work on elm as in the tree, and Dutch elm disease, not as in the agricultural programme. Thank you. And then finally, where relevant, we will commission directly from other research providers, and these do include quite a wide range. So we're going to hear from John in a little bit about the Living Ash project, so I won't talk about it here, but it's a really great example of how we can work with specialist providers when they've got the right skills to meet our needs. And I think the final slide is Trees Outside Woods project. So this is a shared outcomes fund project. This is when Treasury directly supports public sector agencies to come together. And this is a really great project where we're working with 5 local authorities, as well as the Tree Council, so another NGO, and Natural England. And this project's all about improving our ability to plant and grow trees in non-woodland areas. So this is all part of that resilient landscapes part of our work that I mentioned earlier. So that's the end of my talk. It was whistle stop. I'm sorry. I hope you can see the slides a little bit more at your leisure when you have time, but hopefully that gives you a good flavour of why we do research and what we're aiming to get from it, and how to form a bit of a sort of background context to the rest of the talks.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Claire. Great to get that overview, and good to hear about some projects that I've been personally involved with as well. So let me introduce John McLaughlin then. Hi, John.
Hi.
John is the current CEO of the Future Trees Trust, but he spent his career working elsewhere, so in the NHS for 18 years, as the CEO of one of the largest mental health and housing charities in the Thames Valley. He's also been executive chair of the Raw Workshop, which is a wood recycling charity that provides employment for vulnerable adults. As I said, John is now CEO of Future Trees Trust, which is really nice organization, and actually their head of research, Joe Clark, is an honorary member of the organization I work for, so the Association of Applied Biologists. So there's lots of links across the piece. So John is going to talk about the Living Ash project. So if you can share your screen, John, and then we'll hopefully that will work out. Rachel, we're going to come back to you in a moment.
Yeah.
Brilliant. That looks good. Thanks, John.
Just checking, yeah, we got that?
Looks good.
Okay, so thank you, Geraint. And just to say apologies from Joe Clark, who is the real expert on the Living Ash project, but she's out on field work in these 2 weeks, so she asked me to be a very poor substitute, so I'll do my best. Please bear with me. So a little bit of background to the Living Ash project, and then I'll tell you about phase 1, and then I'll move on to phase 2, and then sort of finish with what we hope to do over the next few years. As people will know, hopefully the Living Ash project started in 2013 after ash dieback was first recorded in the UK in 2012 on the East Coast. And Future Trees Trust, people may or may not know, our prime aim is to carry out research into particularly broadleaf trees to improve plant material, particularly for the forestry industry. And at the time that ash dieback was identified, Future Trees Trust had over 40,000 ash trees in research trials across the country. So we were approached by Defra to look at a project, the lab project, to actually screen the 40,000 trees that we had in all our trial sites. It has to be said, and just following on from Claire's presentation, very much the lab project was very much a partnership approach to looking at ash dieback and potential solutions going forward. We were also we're very keen that not only we looked at the Future Trees Trust resources, but also the wider environment, including the Forestry Commission, tree health officers, wildlife trusts, other NGOs, other organisations, and indeed the general public through the citizen science. The initial phase of lab was threefold. One was to look at the research and development of tissue culture techniques, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The goal was to find 400 tolerant genotypes, which represents 1% of the breeding resource. And we know that this was a realistic ambition because of data that was coming out of Europe, where ash dieback was prevalent much earlier. And the final aim was to secure future resources on public forest estate and make freely available to researchers in the future. And along the bottom of the slide, you'll see, the genuine partnership approach to LAP, which initially was led by the Earth Trust. It had the Silver Foundation, commissioned obviously by Defra, involved Forest Research and Future Trees Trust. At the same time that the Living Ash project was commissioned, Forest Research were commissioned by Defra to carry out mass screening trials. So there were 155,000 trees planted on 14 sites during spring of 2013, predominantly across the east coast of England, where ash dieback was first found. Of this, there were 15 different provenances, British, Irish, European, and the seed orchard. And very early on, there were significant differences between the sites, which is really, really interesting. But what we've seen over the time since 2013, that actually the differences in the provenance have decreased to the point where they're statistically, not of interest. And it's quite clear that it's a single tree trait, or we believe to be a single tree trait rather than a provenance trait. So how did we do it? This is, we found trees that appeared to be very, very tolerant in areas of high infection. We secured the cyan material from the outer crown, and they were grafted by Eastmoreland Research. They were grafted in 2018, and here you can see in this slide, they've been grafted, and this is the grafting at about a year old. At the same time, Forest Research were grafting their tolerant trees from half of their mass trials. And at this point, it became quite clear that the two separate projects actually had the same objective, which was to find and secure tolerant trees for the future. So the two projects actually came together at the end of 2018, and of course supported by Defra. And in December 2019, we planted the National Archive for Tolerant Material on the public forest estate, and we had 3,000 grafted ash trees. This has led to phase 2 of the lab project, again commissioned by Defra and involving numerous partners who have very significant and important roles to play. The overall aim, obviously, is to carry on assessing the National Archive and the mass screening trials. We want to reproduce the most tolerant selections, and we also want to replace poorer selections, because what we found is that some of the trees that were chosen as tolerant very early on actually have turned out to be less tolerant than we would have hoped. So we will be replacing the less tolerant trees over time. We also want to test selections via LCMS. I think Claire referred to this earlier, and I'll see if I can sort of pronounce it correctly. It's liquid chromatography mass spectrometry. I'm sure there are scientists here who can tell us even more about that, and I'll come on to that in a little bit. We also want to test selections via controlled inoculations, and we want to carry on with the research and development into cuttings. What we want to do is to get the ash onto their own roots, which will reduce the areas of infection routes. And again, this project runs from 2019 to 2024, and you can see across the bottom the partners in this queue: Fera, Defra, Forest Research, and Future Trees Trust. This slide just shows some of the research data to date, and this is the resource that's based at the Earth Trust in South Oxfordshire, where they have over 4,000 trees in trials. And as you see from very early on, quite a high percentage, 25% of trees look to be absolutely healthy and tolerant. But as we got to 2022, that figure had reduced to 0.5% overall, and actually in total 20 very healthy trees. It seems like a very small number, but these 20 trees could provide really, really important material for planting in the future. This is the data from the National Archive, planted in December 2019, with the selections that were made in 2017. And again, you will see that the numbers are following relatively closely the data that we have collected in South Oxfordshire. So just talking about the work on the LCMS, this is basically a chemical fingerprint for trees. And what we're doing is we're selecting 50 of the most tolerant and 50 of what we describe as susceptible trees. We're collecting, well, we're not actually Fera doing this work first. We're collecting leaf material, which they then run the tests on. And what we want to do is build up a chemical picture of tolerance versus susceptibility. This information will then be used to screen all the trees and trials. And we know that this is a really reliable method based on data and experience from our European colleagues, and as Claire said, with liaising with them, because they've had ash dieback much earlier than us. I mentioned earlier as well the controlled inoculation work, which has been carried out by Forest Research. Here's Caroline carrying out direct stem and leaf spore inoculations. These are cuttings from our research trials, and both tolerant and susceptible trees are being tested. So there's some encouraging early results showing tolerant material looking really good after infection, and susceptible trees have already succumbed. So this slide illustrates the work that's been done by Kew, and this is the cuttings work where we're attempting to get ash onto their own roots. It's notoriously difficult work to do, but as I said before, if we can get ash onto its own roots, it will reduce the variables in the data and the research going forward in terms of route of infection. So to date, all mature cuttings that we've tried have failed, or that Kew have tried. Very young cuttings are showing 80+% success, which is, getting close to where we are with grafted material. Grafted material, we have a success rate of 85–90%. And the work on teenage or juvenile cuttings is ongoing, but just to stress that this is particularly difficult work. But the work continues. This is a really interesting slide. Because of our continuous monitoring of the trees that we have in trials, we've noticed that some trees on initial inspection appear to be highly infected, but on re-inspection a year later, the tree looks much more healthy and the lesions appear to be healing. So Defra have provided additional funding for research to be carried out to dissect these lesions to establish whether the fungus is indeed dead or active, or actually lying dormant in the lesion waiting to be reactivated. So these could prove to be really interesting trees to breed from in the future if they have, if they've proven that they actually can recover in some form, and could really significantly affect what we do in the future. The next steps, we want to assess many more estates and woodlands in the summer of 2023. We also have planned to collect graft wood in January 2024. As I say, we have to plan for the grafting in 2024 because we're not sure that the development, getting them on their own roots, is actually going to work. We want to screen all the trees in the trials using LCMS. And we, as I said before, we want to replace the poor selections from 2017 with better, more tolerant selections. The selections we made in 2017 were too early, and the actual disease hadn't taken a full hold in the UK. We've also, with Defra, identified a second archive site in Scotland, and that site's been maintained and looked after as we speak. And we all know that Defra are considering the next steps in the breeding programme, traditional genomic selection, or both. And we look forward to working with all our partners going forward. And I think that's that.
Great, thanks very much, John. That's great. Thank you for that introduction to the Living Ash project. And as you said, any detailed questions for Joe Clark, I think, right? For sure. Okay, so let's go back to Rachel's talk now. I think hopefully some of the problems have been solved. So Ellie is going to share her screen, and Rachel, you are going to talk about those slides. Okay.
Okay, so I work at Fera Science, and today I'm going to give you a brief overview of one of the UFresco projects that Fera scientists are involved in. And that project is preparedness in biological control of priority biosecurity threats. The project is led jointly by Fera and Plant and Food Research in New Zealand, and it involves a total of 17 partners from 12 different countries. If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so I'll start by giving you a little bit of background as to why there is a need to be better prepared to manage priority biosecurity threats. Firstly, management of invasive species tends to be reactive at the moment once the pest arrives and an outbreak is discovered. And usually eradication is attempted, but if eradication is unsuccessful, then strategies will switch to managing the risk by using means to suppress the pest population and slow its rate of spread. Classical biological control is the introduction of a non-Indigenous biological control agent, which I'll refer to as a BCA during this talk. And classical biological control is recognised as a key strategy to manage invasive insect pests. So a good example of this management strategy is the deliberate introduction of 4 species of exotic parasitic wasps into North America for the management of the invasive emerald ash borer. However, a deliberate introduction of an exotic biological control agent is subject to regulatory measures, including a very rigorous risk assessment and review process. And this whole process can take many years before approval to release the BCA is granted. And during all this time, of course, the pest population can often build up and spread. So therefore, it's becoming increasingly important to identify future biosecurity risks and to prepare in advance for managing those risks to help mitigate the impact of their establishment on native ecosystems. If I can have the next slide, please. So preemptive classical biological control is therefore seen as a novel approach with potential to enhance effective preparedness for a potential invasion of a pest species. Natural enemies can be selected, they can be screened, and they can be pre-approved for release in the eventuality of a pest invasion. And it allows for the release of natural enemies against the target pest at a much earlier point in the emerging management programme, and therefore it can potentially significantly reduce the economic and the environmental damage that is associated with the pest. And the importance of preemptive risk assessment is recognised in New Zealand by the Environmental Protection Authority, who recently approved the conditional release of a parasitic wasp for the control of the brown marmorated stink bug. In England, Defra also recognises the importance of preemptive risk assessment and it's funding work through the Future-Proofing Plant Health Partnership to prepare preemptive risk assessments for parasitic wasps for managing emerald ash borer. And it's this acknowledgement by Defra that action needs to be taken ahead of incursion and the importance of preemptive risk assessment that led to the initiation of this particular UFresco project. I can have the next slide, please. Thank you. So the overall aim of this project is to establish a biological control network to share knowledge and information on priority biosecurity threats and biological control agents to increase preparedness for incursions of invasive invertebrate species. And there are 3 main objectives to the project. These are to review the priority pests and the potential for preemptive classical biological control, to produce a standard to assess feasibility to conduct preemptive risk assessment for the introduction of a biological control agent, and finally to establish a network and repository for the exchange of information. Next slide. So each partner country started off by making a list of their key priority pests, and these lists were collated. And then the next task was to produce fact sheets identifying the most promising classical biological control agents for each of the key pests that were identified by more than one partner country. So this slide just shows an example fact sheet that I prepared in relation to classical biological control of emerald ash borer. And it broadly covers the history of classical biological control against emerald ash borer, the most promising natural enemies that could be used for classical biological control, and also other natural enemies that could perhaps be considered. And in total, the whole project as a whole prepared 25 fact sheets for 25 different pest species. If I can have the next slide, please. So the project partners also worked together to develop and draft a decision framework and an associated guideline document to assess the feasibility of starting preemptive risk assessment for classical biological control agents. And the decision framework that we came up with is divided into 3 main sections. The first relates to availability of background information for the selected biological control agent. And then the next 2 sections relate to the availability of information on potential non-target species that might be affected if the BCA were to be used, and also a section covering the logistics of bringing the biological control agent into the country for host specificity testing. We can have the next slide, please. So once the decision framework had been prepared, the project partners then tested it out using some of the potential BCAs that we identified for our key priority pest species. So in our particular case, we tested out feasibility of preemptive risk assessment for use of a parasitic wasp known as Phasgonophora sulcata against the 2-line chestnut borer. And in this instance, the outcome was that preemptive risk assessment for this particular BCA would not be feasible. The main reasons for this outcome were because the parasitic wasp is not currently commercially available or indeed readily available from other sources to be able to obtain sufficient specimens to carry out the necessary host specificity testing. We also found that data was lacking to be able to determine whether the UK climate would be suitable for this particular biocontrol agent. And a further consideration that was flagged up during the feasibility assessment process was that this parasitic wasp had certain characteristics that would prohibit mass rearing in preparation for any release. But we then tested out the framework on another example, in this case a parasitic wasp called Tamarixia triosea, which attacks the potato psyllid. And the outcome in this case was that preemptive risk assessment would be feasible, as all the information that would be required for risk assessment is either already available within the literature, or it should be relatively easy to gather through experimentation within quarantine facilities. So the next stage of this work is to conduct full preemptive risk assessment for a selection of the BCAs that have been identified as suitable for preemptive risk assessment through this decision process. And a decision will be made at the next project partner meeting in February to discuss and decide upon which biological control agents to take forward for preemptive risk assessment. And the idea is that each partner will conduct a different risk assessment and share with the other partners. Partner countries have broadly similar risk assessment requirements, but these can be easily modified to meet the particular needs of individual countries. And there'll be an online repository which will allow the information to be freely available, thus making it easier for people conducting risk assessments in the future to find relevant information. And so this approach is of benefit to all. And then finally, a further objective of the project is to set up a biocontrol network to make all of the information produced within the project freely available through an online portal. And a project area will be made available on the New Zealand Better Border Biosecurity B3 website. And it's hoped that this will be made available very shortly. And then it's the intention of the project partners to keep this network going after the end of the current project and to look for opportunities to further advance the work that we've conducted so far. I can have the next slide, thank you. And that's just a quick run through of that particular project. I'd just like to say thank you to Defra for funding the work through this UFresco partnership.
Great, thank you very much, Rachel. I'm glad we got to hear about that in the end. That's great, very interesting stuff indeed. Okay, so let's move swiftly on for our final speaker. So my final speaker is Bianca Ambrose-Oji, who is the Principal Social Scientist at FR, Forest Research, and she describes herself as an environmental sociologist. So Bianca's forestry career has spanned 25 years, including time as action researcher, consultant, practitioner, trainer and university lecturer. and she's worked really all around the world. Today, Bianca is going to talk about 3 examples of co-design for tree health projects. So if you can share your screen, Bianca, that would be great. Okay. And just a quick note, for me, I need to disappear now, I'm afraid. So thanks for coming, everyone. My colleague, Cara, is going to deal with the Q&A afterwards. So thanks very much for coming, everyone. I'll see you next time, and we look forward to hearing from you, Bianca. Go for it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Geraint. And I'm really, really hoping I'm not going to have the same problem as Claire did earlier. Great. Fantastic.
That's good. That's good.
Super. Good. Good afternoon, everybody. So I just want to let you know quickly what I'm trying to do with my presentation. I just want to introduce the policy context, and I want to talk about this term co-design so that you understand what approach we were taking. I'm going to draw on 3 examples. Hopefully I've got enough time to do that. And as it happens, they come from the programme of research that Claire mentioned earlier, which is the Future-Proofing Plant Health. All 3 of the examples I'm going to have a look at. And really what I'm here to do is to pick up on that co-design piece that Claire mentioned in her introduction, because we all know that it's not enough to have the biological sciences working hard on scientific solutions to our problems with pests and pathogens. It all depends on whether or not people, land managers and others, actually believe in the solutions that we're coming up with and how quickly we can get them to use what science is providing them with in terms of solutions. So this is very much work around raising people's awareness of these different evidence-based solutions that you're all working hard on, and working on how to make sure that land managers and others' responses, their management responses and their behavioural responses, actually pick those up and achieve some of the outcomes that policy are really looking for. So just then to think about that policy context, co-design. So there's been a big push towards co-design across all parts of Defra, certainly since 2016, 2017. So that's been driven in part by our exit from the EU and the chance to do things differently, but also it's been gathering momentum in the social sciences fields and in practical fields as well, because there's this increasing realization that if you don't get end users involved in designing solutions or policy options that you want them to pick up, then you're hardly likely to get the response and the size of outcome that you're looking for if they haven't had some kind of stake in that process. So there are plenty of examples from health and social care or from areas such as landscape or place planning where real positive results have been realised by taking this co-design approach. If you go into the academic literature, so some key people here might be Emma Blomkamp. There's lots of debate about what co-design actually is, and there's, the academic discussion about the definition and so on. But for us, very much within the team that's been working on these 3 projects, for us, we have the overall sort of co-production approach that involves lots of people in producing something, but co-design is really specific. It is that piece which is about designing rather than delivering or planning the actual intervention. So it's thinking about the design, what the design should look like and who it's for. And co here, the togetherness, we're really talking here about a whole range of different actors. So we are talking about the policy community, and we've worked very, very closely with Defra policy colleagues in the plant and the tree health teams and the wider teams to develop these things. It involves researchers who are an important part of the mix. It involves delivery agencies, so people who will be taking out the policy options, the interventions, selling those with a small s to end users, and it also involves end users, so land managers in many cases. So that's a big team of people coming together, but very much that it's about design. So this is the kind of framework that we used, and I thought it was worth putting this up because it's been really useful for us in our journey. So this was developed in 2019 and really publicised in 2019 by the Design Council, and this is what they call their sort of double diamond approach. And what this is trying to show you is that we start on the left-hand side with a sort of problem space, if you like, or a real challenge. And we're moving through to the solution space on the right-hand side, or the sort of finally designed product, the outcome. And you'll see there are 2 triangles there. And what the triangles are trying to show you is that you start off your journey of discovery, And then you're getting broader and broader in the kind of evidence and the discussions that you're having with people in the co-design process. And then you're sort of narrowing it down in that sort of definition phase. And then the second phase, you discover and you define by talking to people, by finding out more about their context and their acceptability of different kinds of policy options or scientific solutions. You then move into a second phase, which is developing. So it's enacting, making, prototyping what it is you're aiming for in that co-design process, and then you actually deliver it at the end there. So that kind of framework was the way in which we were thinking about these three examples that I'm going to introduce you to. And if I move on to the next slide, I'm going to talk about one of those examples now. So this was a co-design process that has been looking at tree health policy options. So here we're looking at, when I say policy options, that mix that can be designed around grants, advice and regulation, so different kinds of incentives, different kinds of advice, different ways of supporting land managers to act for tree health. And the grants and the advice are very much linked in with those evidence-based solutions, those interventions that biological sciences and others are working on. So what's the appropriate mix of those different policy options, and how should they be designed? So that was the overall aim of this particular project. And I've put there on the top left of the slide, the link through to the project page, so you can go and read about this in greater detail if you want to. So three objectives here: build understanding between all of those partners in the co-design process. It's really important to build that understanding because that builds trust. And once you get that understanding and trust, the kinds of exchanges that you have in that discover and define phase become more than people just saying things for the sake of it or saying the obvious things. The second objective is the co-design piece, to find out which options are likely to support or incentivize land managers to respond to different kinds of tree pests and pathogens. And also we were really interested in the whole idea here of going beyond the management of the tree pest and pathogen and thinking very much about landscape restoration after disease outbreaks. So that takes us also into the realm of incentivizing good biosecurity practice as well. And our third objective on this project too was to understand what kind of advice and information and what kinds of social networks could also support these efforts and be designed into the tree health policy options. And that's really important because this advice and information also links back to the evidence-based solutions that biological and other sciences are coming up with. People have got to believe in them, people have got to understand them before they're actually going to accept them and use them. So just to look now at the process of that project. So here's that double diamond framework that we used. And I think it's worth putting this up here because I wanted to indicate how long these processes can take. So the co-design process here, that discover, define, talk to people, find out more about their context, understand what they want and what they will accept. Started there in 2018 and ran through until 2021. So really intense activity, and I'll show you in the next slide what that looked like. And then of course that's not the end of it. So we did actually produce something in that design process, which was the tree health pilot, which we're now taking into that prototyping phase where we're testing things out and we're evaluating land managers' responses in a real and live situation because they have policy options that picking up and trying out. So that's going to take another couple of years. So the social evidence collection and the social science side of things can often take just as long as the biological science side, but it's important to do these processes thoroughly to get real answers. So just looking at that first triangle, what did we actually do? So we had a whole rhythm of activity. We spent some time engaging different land managers and others in the co-design process through a whole set of different activities. So that's what these yellow circles are showing you. So lots of deliberative workshops with different kinds of exercises to bring out information, evidence, encourage discussion. all the way through the discover and define phase and into the development phase. And then they were sort of punctuated with a series of collaborative analyses of that evidence as it was being gathered, which was led by the researchers. And then that went through to a whole phase where policy colleagues went into what they called design sprints, really pushing forward the design of what they could actually offer in terms of the policy options, so the grants, regulations, advice, and so on. So overall, in this 3-year period, we engaged more than 300 land managers in these different activities. And what was really important, and something which co-design finds quite difficult to maintain, is interaction through a period of co-design. So you don't have lots of different people. If you can carry through some people from the start to the finish of the process, that's really important, because they really understand what it is you're driving at and can actually sort of increase the veracity of the evidence that you're collecting. What was the sort of outcome of all of that? Well, we deliberated long and hard. Was this co-design process democratic and representative? Because that's one of the big questions that you'll find being posed in the academic literature. And I do have to say that I think we were really successful bringing forward those 300 participants, particularly the 60 that went through the whole process. But it's always a case of self-selection. However hard you try to engage with land managers and other stakeholders, there are always those who are more willing to come forward or more able to come forward. And we really did find that some of our audience were very hard to reach. So for us in this particular project, we found significant challenges trying to connect with a wide variety of farmers, for example. We were thinking there about the different methods that we use, the different activities within those workshops. Because developing policy is a live process, and because you're sort of exposing the process to quite a large public audience, I think sometimes we felt that innovation in our methods was a little bit risky. So I'm not sure that we necessarily brought in as many viewpoints or elicited as many different kinds of opinions as we might have been able to if we'd been a bit less risk averse around the innovation in our methods. But there was a lot of value in this. So that is a lot of people to have involved in a process. There was definitely a lot of learning. So we really met that objective in the exchanges between land managers, other stakeholders, and the policy community in particular. Great amount of understanding built up between them around how they were working and what their limitations were. And I would say that our policy colleagues' risk perceptions around what you can do with people in a co-design context was reduced. And of course, we did design the Tree Health Pilot, and that grant and the advice around that is out there live, as I say, being tested. So just very quickly now, because I'm conscious of time, just to quickly introduce you to another couple of examples. So here, looking at the project around OPM, oak processionary moth. And here, policy objectives were to move land managers towards a risk-based approach to managing the pest. So this is moving away from the mindset of total eradication or 100% control of the pest towards appreciating that in certain areas, certain geographic locations, different risk levels are presented by this pest, and therefore land managers ought to be judging whether or not and how, which methods they ought to be using to control the pest. So we were working here particularly with local authorities for the work streams that I was involved with to try and produce tools that would help to move them towards this risk-based approach under their own steam and with their own budgets. So the process here, again, similar, a few years of research in the background before we actually get to the design of the product. So this is the define, explore and define stage, discover and define stage, and we worked here with 38 local authorities, including all different sorts, borough, county and districts. And we worked really, really hard from a position where they were giving us descriptions of how they managed OPM to a real position of trust where they were telling us what they could really do with to move them forward in their OPM management. So they talked about communications tools, guidance. So that information that they were really lacking was what kinds of control methods should they be using? And of those that are coming through from some of the biological science projects, which ones were reliable? When could they use new approaches? How effective were they? They were also very interested in the risks of certain management approaches to biodiversity and other assets. And they were also interested in thinking about financial and other resources. that was where they listed the support. So the outcome of all of that work was this resource hub, because they said they wanted one point of information, one place to go, a one-stop shop for the information that they wanted. And the real success here is this OPM toolkit that I've highlighted, because it's the work with the local authorities identifying what they wanted to know in terms of that information and guidance, which is contained in that toolkit. And our co-design process there produced that as the output. So not a grant, not incentives, not support in that sense, but very much a information and guidance resource that includes a lot of information about the biological science work and innovative approaches to management. And then I'm running out of time, so just say that we've also been doing similar work, producing a toolkit or a guide in this case for ash dieback with farmers. So this came out of the difficulty that we had in the first project that I spoke to you about, connecting with farmers, and they're very specific ways of understanding trees, trees outside of woodlands, trees on their holdings. So here the objectives were to again start that discover and define process and see whether there was anything that we could do to support farmers to respond to ash dieback rather than just to ignore it, which many of them said they were doing. And also, really importantly, to bring farmer organisations and knowledge intermediaries into the tree health world and get them to begin to understand about ash dieback, but not only ash dieback, use that as a springboard to get them to understand about all the tree pests and diseases and appropriate management. So here again, we had an identification process through that discover and define part of the model, and we had 3 different focus groups that took part and 17 different people contributing to that. And then the guide that you see an illustration of the cover of has been a very intensive co-design process with a whole range of different landowners, farmers and intermediaries. So just to comment on that sometimes this co-design process, if you haven't got easy connections with these hard to reach audiences, it takes quite a lot of extra time, some engagement and communication skills that you need to tailor to those different kinds of audiences. And it's very important to find who it is you want to work with to make sure you've got the full gamut of the community taking part. And I think I should just end it there as we're running short of time, and also just acknowledge and say thank you to all the partner organisations that took part in these various projects, because it wasn't just me, obviously it was me and a very large team of people in all of those. So I think I should end it there. Thank you very much.